Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. We're recording on Monday the 20th of April 2026 after quite a long hiatus, which we do apologise for, but there's been a lot going on and we've been very busy, but we are back and we hopefully are going to be back a little bit more regularly from now on. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the key developments that have been happening in maritime affairs, broadly in the Indo-Pacific, but a little bit more widely. And we try and keep abreast of all of the things that have been happening. So how are you going, Jen? It's been a while.
It has been a while, and sorry to our listeners for the negligence in recording. I'd love to say it's because we both took 3 months holidays over Christmas. That would be wonderful. But actually it's because the world has been so chaotic that it has driven a schedule that hasn't really permitted recording of this till now. But the good thing is we actually have way too much to talk about. So certainly 2026 has given us a little bit of discussion points when it comes to the maritime and just to be corny, re-emphasized why maritime matters. And I think if anyone wasn't sure on that in Australia, take a look at the price of fuel in Australia. And who would have thought it that we are vulnerable when it comes to fuel supplies? It's not like people have been talking about this for decades, but we're seeing it in practice. We often talk about the fuel supplies. Of course, it is also pharmaceuticals. I recently, in the last kind of 18 months, learned a lot about fertilizers, specifically urea, that we are dependent on. In fact, as a segue, we actually import a lot of that from Brunei, and I found that out when I was in Brunei last year. But it's been weird to see terms like urea make mainstream media, and it just reinforces that we are a maritime nation.
Absolutely. No matter how much we prattle on about it, it's the changing price at the fuel pump that is what will really focus attention. But we can claim that we've had some impact anyway.
We can claim. We know it might be true, but I mean, I guess the other things in terms of, and we will come to the Iran conflict, the Iran war. We have set ourselves a time limit that we will only talk about it for 5 or 6 minutes. Otherwise, we will talk about it all day. There are many podcasts on that. But it's crazy the other things that have happened this year. And I just wrote down a list before, and I've probably missed some, Richard, that you can pick me up on. But I distinctly remember, it's not quite this year, but almost, right at the end of December, there was so much discussion around Exercise Justice Mission, which is a long time ago now. But I remember it being a large Chinese naval exercise that enveloped Taiwan. I remember it because at the time I was driving across the Nullarbor, and every time I'd get phone reception, I'd have a text message from a journalist saying, "Can you talk to us about Exercise Justice Mission?" Of course, we then had more information in estimates in February about the Chinese Naval Task Group that came down to just outside of the Australian Exclusive Economic Zone in November, December last year. Then we had Venezuela and boarding operations that occurred all across the globe. We also had the fleet review in Australia where I can't remember the details now. Lots of ships and lots of nations came down. Vietnamese ship.
I think.
Do you remember the details?
So I was just trying to dig this up, and it's certainly vessels from 19 nations, but nobody seems to. Everyone says approximately 30 vessels. I would have thought you'd know, but It feels like a very long time ago already, but it really wasn't that long ago. But it was quite a pretty impressive review, even if it was sort of slightly overshadowed by wider global events.
And it also pissed rain that day in Sydney. But there were significant crowds out to see the fleet review despite the rain. So I think that was pretty cool. Toowoomba went through the Taiwan Strait, which I have vague memories of that being a thing with limited interaction or harassment, or at least publicly available harassment.
And I guess there's also been the continual or more regular regional presence deployments, which seem to have, I guess, unsurprisingly not attracted a huge amount of attention given how much else has been going on. But it's easy to kind of forget that. The RAN in particular is continuing to operate its very regular kind of rotation of regional presence deployments.
You're absolutely right. Speaking of those regions, Trying to do a segue. I'm still terrible at segues. But more harassment of Philippines Coast Guard vessels, more Chinese island building in the South China Sea. We won't get to all of this. Australia has a new Chief of Navy that will be taking over mid-year, and the new Chief of Defence Force will also be a naval officer. They're both submariners, so it shows a clear focus.
It was quite the shift, right? Hammond was first Submariner, and now there's going to be a Submariner CDF and Submariner Chief of Navy. So
was he the first? Was he the first Submariner?
I'm pretty certain he's the first Submariner. I can't remember.
Who am I thinking of? No, I think you might be right. I think I'm thinking of a former DCN. I don't know.
I'd have to go back and check that now, but
Your history is better than mine, so let's go with you're right. What have we missed? There's other things. What else is happening?
Oh, I'm sure there's lots of things that we've missed. Quite a lot of discussion around varying different Chinese shipbuilding and all sorts of innovative things there. There's been quite a lot of discussion coming out of the US around AUKUS and some positive news stories about US submarine construction and some...
What?
I know.
Positive news?
Shock, horror.
Somebody published it? Oh, wow. I'm shocked.
But yeah, lots and lots going on. And then even things, AUKUS-related things like the visit of the Astute-class submarine to Western Australia that got rapidly curtailed as she got pulled back as part of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East.
I completely forgot about that. There you go.
So yeah, lots going on. But it's hard to keep a track at the moment.
It is. But what are we going to talk about today? Because we're not going to talk about all of those things today. So what's first on the list?
So first on the list is the new Australian National Defence Strategy and the Integrated Investment Program. I am right. I have to get this. I get it wrong every single time.
Here are two I prepared earlier, and I get it wrong too. Having worked on the Integrated Investment Program, I still said on national TV last week, Integrated Investment Project? I made something up. Nobody called me out on it, which is great because clearly nobody was listening to it. Anyway.
So these are the, as set out in the Defence Strategic Review, there needs to be more regular updates. And so there's a biennial cycle, which has been set out. And so there was a NDS and IIP in 2024, and they have now been updated this year. And it's quite a big thing in the relatively niche world of Australian defence commentators and kind of politicians, etc. It was released by Richard Marles, gave a speech at the Press Club, a pretty combative speech, I would say, at the Press Club. I haven't listened to the recording, but I read the transcript and I was,
It was. I was focused on my lamb backstrap, which was very nice. But yes, it was a very combative speech.
I will pick up one quote, which I did like, because I think it's something that both of us have said it paraphrases something that both of us have said at various points, which is that he said that we are the world's largest island nation with the third largest maritime domain, yet our population is 56 in size and our industrial base is relatively small. Australia has a unique defence challenge, which we've historically addressed through partnership with a major power. I'm very pleased that actually a politician has come out and said something like this, even though it should be patently obvious that the maritime focus of Australia's defence and security challenge is undoubtedly now centre stage. And I think that's also come through in the IIP. It was already by far the dominant sector of funding within the IIP. That's actually grown. I think it's now over 40%.
It is 41%.
41%, there we go.
But we should remind everyone, by the way, because this is frequently misquoted, that maritime investment in the IIP does not mean naval investment in the IIP.
Yep, absolutely. Lots of things like khaki boats and blue planes are also maritime. Anyway, what's in the NDS? Well, I think most people would agree that the NDS is very much a continuity document in most respects. It draws a lot of things through from the 2024 NDS, and there's not a huge amount that's radically new. In terms of money, there is some additional money. That the figures are 14 billion in the next 4 years, which is the forward forward estimates period. and then 53 billion over the next 10 years. I think most people tend to focus on the forward estimates period because that's where government actually has to kind of make savings in order to be able to put money forward, whereas the longer period of time is a little bit like monopoly money. So there is some more money. Much of this seems to be focused on sort of remote and autonomous systems and integrated air and missile defense. I think that there's been some questions over whether or not there is enough in the new NDS, and I think Jen will probably have something to say on this. And I think there are also have been questions over some of the tone of the new NDS and how it fits into what's acknowledged to be a rapidly changing world and whether or not it feels a little bit out of touch with that. But that's kind of my, I guess, headline. What were your takes?
Look, I agree with everything you've just said. It was pleasing to see the Deputy Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, discuss our strategic circumstances, our dependence on the maritime domain and our reliance on our major ally in those terms. I think it's also been refreshing, and don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say that the author of the public version of the NDS, whom I know, actually read anything I'd written, but it was pleasing to see a lot of the things that we've been talking about, a lot of the conceptualizing dependency on the maritime domain, strategy denial not being sea denial, importance of supply chain resilience and industrial policy as part of maritime strategy, localized sea control, all these things actually really be articulated in the NDS. In fact, when it talked about the alliance, I can't remember what the 24 NDS said, but I'm sure it says something about values-based. It very much talks about aligned national interests, which I think was a bit of a change in tone in the relationship between Australia and the US too. So, look, I think it was good. I do have a piece coming out with Lowy summarising what I think about the maritime elements of it. In terms of the strategy was consistent really with the 2023 DSR, the 24 NDS. I do think, though, it put more meat on the bones of some of those maritime elements and how you achieve that strategy, which I thought was pleasing. I did critique it slightly in my piece, saying it would still be better to have the concept that I've put forward a few times. I think other people have too, probably for decades, about a layered maritime strategy, thinking of more of a holistic view in terms of the relationship between supply chain, defence industrial policy, coast guards, all of those things up to high-end surface combatants and submarines. There is more of a focus, as you mentioned, on autonomy and uncrewed capabilities. It takes up more of a focus both in the budget, but also in the explanations around undersea warfare. Clearly, there is a pivot towards undersea warfare and seabed warfare as a component of that. Whether it is effective or not, or whether it's enough, it's hard to say, because most of the stuff that exists in this domain, even the details, for example, on the capabilities of Ghost Shark and now Speartooth we've seen announced, which is a large uncrewed underwater vehicle built by CT Robotics in Australia. Lots of their capabilities are classified and hard to exactly work out. We've talked about that a little bit more. I was disappointed to see one very small, succinct paragraph on replenishment vessels, effectively saying 2 is enough, 2 is not enough, and still no ambition around trying to tackle with the fact that really the Hunter-class program should have been accelerated. You know, we're building this frigate now, and we're still saying it's not coming till 2034. And there are ways to try and accelerate those things. You know, whether you have more workforce, you do double ships. If we really are in a strategic environment that I think is correctly articulated in the National Defence Strategy, and I think the language was refreshing, and the language in the Deputy Prime Minister's speech was refreshing, then the capability, priorities and timeframes just don't match the risk that is articulated. Mine warfare gets a bit more of a Guernsey. Mine warfare was like 1 paragraph in the IIP 2024. It's like 3 paragraphs in 2026. It kind of expands a little bit more on how autonomy is going to be the way ahead, but doesn't really explain the concept that Australia is going after. Certainly not clearly, and you can kind of infer it from the approaches of other countries, but it would be better to be clearly stated. Hydrography gets more of a Guernsey too. I don't even think it was mentioned. P24 gets 2 paragraphs, but really in terms of capability uplift, it doesn't change. So that's kind of what I think is. Oh, actually, one more. I wasn't surprised to see this, but I still think it is aspirational. The large, optionally crewed surface vessel is still in NDS 26. Look, I think we should be moving towards trying to look at those capabilities for sure, but there's been a lot of water under the bridge when it comes to that capability since it was announced, including a lot of clarity from the US that they are moving away from that capability. And the plan was always to jump onto a US program. So I think I said in my Lowy piece, this is hugely aspirational. And I think that maybe it was too soon for the announcement for that to be scrapped, but I don't see that withstanding NDS 28. So that'd be my quick take. I haven't talked about funding. I did have a piece in the Fin Review. Look, the funding. Look, it's easy to say the funding is not enough, and it's easy to critique, and it is true that defence funding has increased. I think the perception of the historic nature of defence funding and the magnitude of the increase reported in the media is overblown. I think some of that is through creative maths and creative accounting. So everybody was calling for 3% of GDP of defence spending. Now, miraculously, we have 3%, but it's in 10 years and it's not actually 3%. It's actually, I haven't done the exact maths, but anywhere between 2.3 and 2.5% on the old metrics. So that's a little bit of creative accounting. But I guess the way I've kind of looked at it is, given the risk articulated in the National Defence Strategy, does our capability timeline for delivery match that risk? And do we address some of the broader gaps around mine warfare, auxiliaries, etc.? The answer for me was still no.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that regard, I'd agree with you. I agree with a lot of the points that you make. I guess a couple of other things. Bit more of a discussion of the integrated air and missile defence, which I think is valid, not only within, or important, not only within kind of the wider ADF frame, but also in terms of very much in terms of maritime and the ability to protect bases and protect key kind of nodes is very important, as has been shown repeatedly, particularly in Ukraine. The vulnerability of naval platforms in port, for example, is something that the Ukrainians have really driven home. So anything that can be beginning to close those kind of gaps, I think is really important. I guess my broader point, I agree with you that there is a little bit more about the supply chains and stuff like that. But I do think, I still feel that it's a national defense strategy, and it is very military focused. And if there's one thing that recent events have once again reinforced, it's the fact that yes, the ADF is a critical part of providing Australia with security, but it cannot by any means be the whole picture. And we need to grapple with that reality that in order to properly secure this country, you need to engage, I hate the phrase whole of government, that type of approach, right? We need to be drawing far more of all of the other parts of government and industry and everything else into the tent in order to have those kind of discussions. And it still feels a little bit kind of tokenistic, some of the talk about resilience and sort of the industry and supply chains and things like this. And even the good news about the recent firing of an Australian manufactured missile, again, the reality, of course, is this is an Australian assembled missile, quite where we get to. It's good news, absolutely, but this gap between rhetoric and reality, and I do feel that we're continuing to miss opportunities in that kind of space. The one area where I guess I think you and I do disagree is around the narrative towards the United States. And I think that it felt pretty tone deaf to me, and in particular Miles's speech and the very strong pushback on Mark Carney and his discussion around sort of middle powers and the end of the rules-based order, and his sort of full-throated support of both the rules-based order and the American alliance at the same time felt really weirdly jarring to me in present circumstances. And I think that whilst I, of course, 100% support the alliance in the defence context, etc., I think we have to be real about where we are. And certainly in terms of tone, I felt that this very much missed the mark. I thought actually the NDS in some ways is a little bit closer than the rhetoric around it. But even there, I think we need to be thinking a bit more deeply. But I think that's maybe a broader discussion than the one for this podcast, and we ought to probably move on.
That's a whole longer discussion. I just want to pick on one point you mentioned, not the alliance, because we'll do that to death. The rhetoric versus reality. This is where I struggled a little bit and find myself struggling to take statements at face value. Back to the point about mine warfare. So I agree that modern concepts of mine clearance certainly involve uncrewed and autonomous capability. And to be fair, have actually for a while. Like, that's not a new trend. The distance at which you can do it is a new trend, but that's not a new trend. But where I become skeptical about whether we are actually solving that is because of the rhetoric versus reality. And there has been, whether it's the 3% of GDP that's not 3% of GDP under normal terms, it becomes hard to put faith in statements like that when they do seem to be quite embellished at times. And I think some of that was probably shone through in the language around some of the elements in the Integrated Investment Program and the National Defence Strategy.
We ought to move on and talk a little
should.
bit about incident which took place in Northeast Asia over the past week or so. This is not by any means a new type of incident. This was involving a New Zealand P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, and it was operating as part of the New Zealand support for the UN sanctions on North Korea. And New Zealand, alongside Australia, has been a regular participant in supporting these sanctions. And the aircraft was operating out of a Japanese base and was operating in the Yellow and East China, or in the airspace over the Yellow and East China Seas. And the Chinese have kicked up quite the fuss over this. Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman stated that the actions of the aircraft undermined China's security interests, increased risks of misunderstanding and miscalculation, and gravely disrupted the order of civil aviation in the relevant airspace. China has put forward a very forthright, I think it's fair to say, protest to the New Zealand government. The Kiwis have played it pretty much with a straight bat and highlighted that they were operating as part of a UN-supported mission and were operating well outside of Chinese territorial airspace, and were doing so with all of the appropriate authorities, etc. Now, I think that this is, as I say, it's not exactly new, and that the Australian P-8s and other forces that have been supporting the same operations in around North Korea have also faced kind of harassment from the Chinese. But I think the focus on New Zealand is interesting, and B, the degree of, I guess, anger almost within the Chinese statements was quite noteworthy. What was your take on this one?
Yeah, so I agree. In fact, the intensity, we started to see that a little bit at the end of last year when Australia would start to publicise when Australia publicised some of the unsafe, unprofessional activities in the South China Sea last year. We saw quite a strong and critical rebuke from China, which was a trend. You didn't necessarily get that response to that degree of intensity. My understanding of this one, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I saw, the first we actually knew about this incident was from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it wasn't like New Zealand released the incident and China responded. That proactive release from China, I think that's new. I don't think we've seen a lot of that. We don't actually know what happened, by the way. There's no information on what actually happened, just some sort of incident with the P-8 and some sort of Chinese asset or something. We don't really know. But I think we're seeing an increasing trend here of, one, China being proactive on these releases, criticizing other countries for operating there, and two, the intensity in terms of the commentary is also increasing.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly, and I think you're right about the trend from the end of last year, because I was kind of unsure as to whether or not there's a degree of, or at least a perception, that the world's attention is focused elsewhere. And the United States in particular is focused elsewhere, and whether or not the Chinese are kind of using this as an opportunity to push a slightly more forceful approach. But I don't know whether that's me reading too much into it, and actually this is a much longer trend. It's always difficult to tell with these sorts of things.
It could be both. The reason I smiled is in the first 2 weeks of the Iran war, which I guess we're going to come to, the amount of articles and social media posts I read that, like, this is it now. Overnight, there's going to be an invasion. Now, I'm deeply paraphrasing, but overnight, there's going to be an invasion of Taiwan. The view that, I mean, yes, of course, China will seize this opportunity if it thinks that the US and others are distracted from the region. Of course, that's just smart thinking. But the view that China would somehow make a significant foreign policy decision, amass all its forces, and invade a very difficult to invade island just because the US was in the Middle East, which it frequently is, seemed a little bit farcical. So I'm glad to see that in the last 5 weeks we haven't had as many doom statements of tomorrow Taiwan's going to be invaded because the US is in the Middle East. Now, I'm not to diminish that, that the impact of US distraction in the Middle East and what that does have on this region. And in fact, that was remarked upon, not in those terms, by the current Chief of Defence Force when he gave a press release, press statement, press engagement about 2 weeks ago. So there is, of course, concern of that. But my remarks were more about the fact that China would make such a significant foreign policy military decision in such a short period of time. I'm highly sceptical.
Absolutely.
What do you think? Do you disagree?
Taiwan's about to be invaded anyway. We're getting towards 2027 and everyone knows that's the deadline, right? Xi Jinping's got it circled on his big calendar. Sorry,
Yes.
my cynicism here is coming through.
I agree. And not to say that like we're not in a period of risk. I mean, we are in a period of risk, but I just don't think things are that simple. Anyway, speaking of things that are definitely not simple, let's talk about Iran. But remember, we have a time limit. Because I'm very much over talking about this. It has occupied my life for 7 weeks. And B, we actually have other things to talk about as well. So what's going on? What's struck you from the maritime elements of the Iran conflict?
What's not struck me, I did not have a nation announcing a formal legal blockade on my 2026 bingo card. I must say, that was quite the take. So in terms of, I guess, if we look more broadly, and I'm going to put my slightly academics hat on here, I think that the way in which the Iranians have used their geography to impact the maritime domain is, to my mind, unsurprising. And I think I'm going to bang my own trumpet. Here we go. Great. I'm doing well. Bang my own drum or blow my own trumpet here.
We can delete that. I'm not sure where you're going right now. We can delete this if necessary.
But I wrote an article about a year or so ago about looking at the Houthis and the Black Sea, and looking at how the changing kind of power relationship between land power and sea power, and how certain new technologies were making it easier to control narrow or sort of coastal littoral type regions, or at least challenge the ability of navies to control littoral regions. And I think you've seen that playing out. Could the Americans force the Straits? Almost certainly. Could they long term be able to assure absolutely the protection of all vessels transiting that strait? That's a very, very different kind of question. And I think that's what you're seeing playing out is how changes in technology, whether they be anti-ship ballistic missiles, whether they be drones, whether they be uncrewed surface vessels, and older technologies like mines, are making it increasingly challenging to operate and to be able to have the level of assurance of sea control that you realistically need to be able to then use those areas. So I thought that is interesting. I think it fits into a much longer trend. I also think it's unsurprising in many ways that the Americans are responding to this by expanding the geographical scope. If you think about it logically, if they'd have actually thought this war was going to last any length of time, they should have implemented a blockade from the get-go. It is one of the powers that having a large global navy enables you to do. And they have this control, and it is something that I think will have an impact. Whether it'll have an impact fast enough remains to be seen. So, yeah, I think that in that respect, I guess that the maritime elements of this conflict have actually, from something that started off effectively as a bombing campaign, it has very rapidly turned into a maritime conflict in a way that has seen you in front of cameras across the world. And I think in some ways we should not be hugely surprised at that. But I think it is very noteworthy in terms of the significance of the maritime and how that kind of plays out.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And there's so much to, I agree with all your comments. I too thought a naval blockade earlier would have been a prudent approach. But also, I guess the US were trying to balance assets, uh, asset availability as well, right? We've also not mentioned, by the way, I'm thinking about this maritime campaign. We've talked about, the sea denial aspects, the range at which sea denial can occur and the effectiveness now with the capabilities that you mentioned. We've talked about naval blockades. It actually feels like it was years ago, but the other element of the geographic expansion, of course, was the sinking of the IRIS Dina off Sri Lanka on the 4th of March, which got everybody qualified as cuff rate maritime lawyers, apparently. If you're interested in the IRS Dina sinking, I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably know what happened. But if you're the 1% that doesn't, effectively there was an Iranian, they call it multi-role frigate. Really, it's the size of a corvette, to be honest, but a bit more upgunned than a normal corvette. Had sailed from the Indian Fleet Review, was at sea once the conflict has commenced. It was about 40 nautical miles from Sri Lanka, and it was torpedoed with a significant loss of life. And, no matter the context, no matter the country of origin, it is pretty horrific and horrible for those people. A horrible way to die. Lots of discussions. Turns out there were 3 Australian submariners on board the USS Charlotte that sunk them, and that raised questions about what makes you a belligerent in an international armed conflict and what does not. Questions around AUKUS, questions around the alliance. There was an op-ed from Tony Abbott that said we should have let them fire the torpedo or something. I'm paraphrasing, but it was pretty close to that. And no, absolutely not. As I think I said in the media at the time, you don't make large foreign policy decisions about joining an international armed conflict based on the training of 3 people on a submarine. So that was not a good suggestion. Obviously, questions about what are lawful military targets. Anyway, I won't drone on. I did have a piece in War on the Rocks, and in fact, I did a podcast with War on the Rocks talking about that. So if you're interested in the legal implications of that sinking, but also I think some of the strategic implications, and I think they are much broader than the Iran war, then you can read and listen to that there. I guess we probably have gone well beyond our 5 minutes.
But so I think we probably ought to mention, given the timing, the actions this morning.
You're
and
right.
The attempt by an Iranian cargo vessel to run the blockade. And she was repeatedly warned by a US destroyer.
For 6 hours. 6 hours she was warned for.
And then the American destroyer targeted supposedly the engine room with a 5-inch gun. Now, on one level, taking action to prevent a blockade runner after it's been warned, highly unsurprising in that respect. Doing so straight off with the main gun is, I would suggest, quite surprising. But I will hand over to you on this one.
Yeah, look, I've been asked a lot of questions about this today. In fact, and yeah, just a name drop that you can tease me about, but I was actually just talking to CNN about this. I think the first thing to note, so the vessel was Iranian flagged, just called the Tosca or the Tuska or something like that. I didn't realize this, but Iran actually has their own national line. I honestly didn't realize this. I can't remember what it's called, something like the Islamic Republic National Shipping Line. It's not quite that. Anyway, look it up. This vessel belonged to that, the Iranian Republic National Shipping Line, that I'm just going to call it now. That's not its actual name. But anyway, you get what I'm talking about. It has actually been sanctioned by the US and other countries for smuggling components to support Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missile program, etc. So this vessel was trying to get into Bandar Abbas. It was about 40 nautical miles-ish from Chabahar, it looks like. Tried to run the blockade at 17 knots. Was warned for 6 hours, and you can actually listen to some of the warnings online. And then eventually the US said, please clear your engine room. We're going to engage you with disabling fire. I guess the bit that was probably not surprising, lots of countries don't contain warning shots in their rules of engagement because they think that that's actually more unsafe. And I think from memory, the US might be one of those countries. I'm not exactly sure, but some countries do go straight to disabling fire in terms of increases of use of force. So warning shot sometimes, and disabling fire. I was a little skeptical, and it's going back a while now since I've served on a ship with a 5-inch gun, about the accuracy of hitting an engine room with a 5-inch gun. But either way, they fired disabling fire, and they've now seized the vessel. I think there's probably I would assume, I don't know, I'm hypothesizing, there's a lot more about this vessel that's not in the public domain. I think, one, they were always going to stop a blockade runner. In fact, legally, if you're going to declare a blockade, one of the legal requirements is it has to be effective, i.e. you actually have to enact it. I think there's two reasons the blockade was declared. One is about economic pressure on Iran. I think the second reason is very clearly not about not allowing Iran to be resupplied with components that would help it rebuild some of its ballistic missile or UAV, USV capabilities. And I would suspect, I don't know, this is not based on any evidence, as a hypothesis, that there was intelligence to suggest that that vessel from the Iranian national line was in fact bringing some of that stuff in. So we'll wait and see if that is clarified or if that ever comes out in the public domain. But I think there is more to this than meets the eye. Anyway, anything else in Iran? We've gone way over our 5 minutes.
I think we've gone way over our 5 minutes, and we ought to move on.
We should.
Another story which has cropped up in the past day or so, which I think is worth mentioning, and again, in many ways, is deeply unsurprising, is the regular crop of the catch, one might say, of high-tech Chinese underwater devices in the waters of Southeast Asia has continued. In this case, it's described as a large torpedo-shaped device between Bali and Lombok, so in Indonesia, and it was discovered by fishermen and near the Lombok Strait. There are suggestions that it is a kind of a underwater monitoring device, effectively, which is used to communicate information, both potentially hydrographic or pathological type information, so temperature, sound, etc., or temperature and other kind of salinity and that sort of thing, but also information potentially on vessels passing through. Now, we know and have known for a long time that the Chinese are very interested in getting as much information on the waters of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean as possible, and have been conducting regular kind of surveys through both civilian and kind of civilian military vessels. And this is widely believed to support submarine operations. And as I say, there's also been regular instances, and I think we've discussed on a number of occasions on this podcast, Chinese kind of, whether they're underwater gliders or other types of uncrewed devices and sensors, which are picked up throughout the waters of Southeast Asia. I know we talked about one in the Philippines, and I think certainly one other in Indonesia. So highly unsurprising in that regard, but I think it does just once again highlight the kind of the battle and the quiet battle that is going on in terms of sort of sensors and information throughout the waters to Australia's north. And this is, whilst we don't often like to call it this, there is something of a Cold War kind of mentality. I think that is absolutely being played out, and you can see it physically manifest in the catches of these kind of fishermen. And it once again highlights the challenging place that lots of these Southeast Asian countries occupy, being kind of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. Not surprising, but still interesting to see when it does wash up. And I was trying to think of, while you were talking, I've forgotten her name, but there is a very good academic from Keele University who has done a lot of analysis and research on China's underwater domain awareness apparatus, for want of a better term. And, this is probably crappy pun, but this is a drop in the ocean in terms of their capability. And I think it is, every time I see a brief where she goes through this, it's actually quite eye-opening, because we don't tend to think about it a lot, but it's something that China has invested in significantly. It also raised for me, while we were talking about earlier things that have happened this year, there was some reporting that came out that actually became drowned out by either Venezuela or Iran that was quite significant. I was actually involved in some of the analysis with Reuters about Chinese hydrographic operations. Now, not new. We know that China has been doing a significant amount of hydrographic surveying across both Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. But what was interesting was to see the areas in which they've focused, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and what that says about potentially where they may be exploring more for submarine operations. Now, there are many reasons that you will do survey operations. It's not all about submarines, but if you look up this reporting from Reuters and you look at some of the strategic locations that this has occurred, it does lend your mind to that. So we better move on. A lot's been happening, especially in the capability space. And I think a lot of announcements actually that have been drowned out by the deteriorating strategic situation, which is a nice way to put it. And one of those, in fact, was the contract signing of the upgraded Mogami, or the next generation frigate, or the general purpose frigate, or whatever you want to refer to it as. So what happened with that contract, Richard?
Yes, so this is the C3000, the general purpose frigate project, which we've been discussing on this podcast for quite a while. The decision was made to go with the Japanese, what's often referred to as Mogami, but is in fact kind of the follow-on class to the Mogami. And this is it's a very capable vessel, and the idea is that the first 3 are going to be delivered from Japanese yards, and the remaining 8 will be built in Western Australia. One of the kind of key elements of this project has always been its kind of broader strategic issues, and I guess that the strengthening of this critical relationship between Australia and Japan. It's a really important defence relationship for Australia, and one which is only going to get more important. And so I guess as part of that kind of symbolism, we saw recently this week the Japanese Minister of Defence came to Australia to formally sign the contract for this new capability, and he did so with Richard Marles, the Australian Minister of Defence. And it really does kind of underpin and underline the broader strategic elements of this project. Now, I think that it's kind of quietly been reported that actually the contract was signed a few months ago and all of this was just for show. But I kind of think that in many ways that's sort of the point, right? That the show matters. And this is not just about a deal between the Australian government and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to build these vessels. This is about cementing a relationship between Australia and Japan. The other thing which I kind of will flag was the changes in cost, which have not been hugely well publicized. The 2024 IIP listed the C3000 project as costing $7 to $10 billion over the next 10 years. The 2026 IIP has it at $15 to $20 billion, so basically a 50% increase. Now, obviously, that is 2 years further on, so there's 2 years more of the project inside that budget, but it is still a very significant growth in cost. And to be honest with you, I think it still sounds pretty light given the likely costs involved in trying to build 8 of these vessels in Western Australia. And of course, the timeline for that. So I suspect that number will go north again. But that has been rather missed in all of the pomp and ceremony.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't actually think it was a big deal. Many disagree with me, including you. So yes, the envelope of 15 to 20 billion. One thing I would say is the document that you see, this wonderful glossy document, is in fact not the Integrated Investment Program. It is a public glossy integrated investment program, being a very large spreadsheet with lots of lines that you don't want to accidentally delete. The figures in this are intentionally not entirely accurate. I would say that they put a fudge factor on them to be able to declassify, and this is why you get envelopes of figures, not what would be the actual figure in the Integrated Investment Program. In terms of the 15 to 20 billion, yeah, look, it does seem a bit of a jump for 2 years, but I think where are we by the time we get to 2036? Well, by then we should have purchased 3 frigates. We should have built at least one and be in the process of building at least one or two. Should be, we'll see, depending on Henderson. But
you are sounding very optimistic at this point in time.
I'm actually not optimistic on that point. I think I was quoted in the review of not being optimistic on that point. But that's what that funding envelope includes. So I don't think it's a significant one. I know there are a few people that wanted to talk about it as being a blowout and mismanagement again. I think that was probably a little bit over the top at this stage. But either way, I guess worth talking about the point, though, in terms of the contract was signed for 3 upgraded Mogamis to be built in Japan. There is a lot of question about whether the next 3 will be built in Australia, and a lot of that depends on where will Henderson be by the time we should start building these, which I suspect would be in 2029. And when you drive past Henderson, I've been spending a lot of time in Western Australia this year, there doesn't seem to be a lot of change. So, but there was also an announcement this year that government had gone to contract for the design of the rebuild of Henderson shipyard, which we didn't mention either because so much is happening.
That was, as I remember it, it's only the head contract, right?
Yes.
So it's
not a lot of progress.
Yes. It's the overarching contract to then start thinking about what you're actually going to be properly doing. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
You're right.
And of course, another thing we've forgotten is the contract for land aircraft heavy, which are also supposedly going to be built in Western Australia. So there's a huge amount that's expected to be coming out of Western Australia. And so far, not a lot has actually happened. And we haven't heard a huge amount about landing craft medium, which is supposed to be coming off the lines pretty soon in order to meet all of the rest of the requirements.
Yeah, I think it was originally meant to be 2026. But even then, I mean, that's only a 500-ton vessel. Austal can easily make that. But yes, you're right. There's lots to be curious about when it comes to Henderson. The other point too, and we're probably going to just keep going. This is what happens when you don't record a podcast for 4 months. The other thing that was interesting, and we won't delve into this too much, it's not either of our areas of expertise, but Henderson was flagged as one of the areas of which they will find alternate financing pathways to rebuild. So this was one of the things that was scoped in the integrated investment program that they will look at. I'm assuming this is really just public-private partnerships, which Defence has done before on some things, but Henderson will be one of the areas targeted to do that. So lots on Henderson, lots to talk about, not what's happening. Anyway, we probably really should wrap this up. There was one more announcement we should cover. It was the new, what are we calling it? The Royal Australian Navy has formally named the Maritime Autonomous Systems Unit, which is good. What's your take on this? What is the Maritime Autonomous Systems Unit, Richard?
It is the structure or the kind of the organisation which will operate what are described here as multiple complementary capabilities in typical defense kind of speak, but basically these are the remote and autonomous systems. So the ones that are mentioned are Ghost Shark, the really big kind of uncrewed submarines, which are on all of the glossies. Defence can't put out any kind of publication at the moment without a picture of Ghost Shark on it. The Blue Bottle uncrewed surface vessels, which are kind of like small yachts that basically don't have anyone on them, but do persistent ISR type of operations, and the Speartooth large uncrewed underwater vehicles, which have received a lot less attention. But I know C2 Robotics have been pushing those for some time and have been very confident about their kind of capabilities. So I think it's good in a regard that there needs to be an organisation which is really beginning to play with lots of these issues, and particularly thinking about, well, how... It's one thing having a capability, it's another, as you'll know very much from your experience with the Fifth Fleet, it's another to actually be able to integrate it and properly use it, and that takes time. And historically, you can see multiple examples of this. If you get a bit of kit, and then you have to spend time working out, well, what does this actually mean? How can we actually operationalize it? How can we use it? How can we integrate it into doing the sorts of things that we want to be doing? So I think in that respect, it's good. Whether or not a standalone unit is the best way to do that, or whether it's actually better to be getting capability out and kind of breaking that up, is, I think, one of the continual battles, and there's all sorts of discussion within literature on military innovation about how best to do these sorts of things. I'm sure there's very strong reasons for doing it in the way they have.
Maybe, probably. Look, I think I actually thought this was a great development. I agree with you in terms of how do you look at integrating some of these newer capabilities. I think with the 3 capabilities that are listed here, and I had to go back and reread it actually because I was surprised to see Blue Bottle was grouped in with it. I thought it was just going to be UUVs because the announcement was of a submariner to command it, and it was Commander Submarines who provided commentary about it. I think in terms of these larger ones, this is the way to go. But I think that some of the smaller, hopefully attritable UAVs and USVs that we should be getting in the fleet and things like, I think they are ones that should just be given to ships, and you just say you crack on and work out how you integrate that. But these ones are significantly larger. So I think this is probably a good decision. And yeah, I hope it goes well.
I think that's going to be all we've got time for. We've
I mean,
already
we're at
hit
the hour mark now. So
the hour mark here, so I think
we shouldn't have said that because everyone will work out how much we delete and how many outtakes there really are in these, which are a lot of outtakes in these. Anyway, thanks, Richard. And yes, maritime does matter, as you know when you pay for petrol. All right. Thanks, everyone.